about eschatology. Fancy word for end times. I remember going to school, bring my Bible with me, and an interested homeroom teacher looked over and said, "Oh, so you got a Bible? What you reading?" I said, "Revelations." And that teacher kind of and kind of pulled away. Wasn't quite sure how to take that. It was quite a few years ago. I was just in high school. But looking at issues of end times, both in the Old and the New Testament, always leaves us kind of wrestling with, well, what is this? Is this some kind of a roadmap? Some kind of a detailed explanation of everything? And I'll probably approach it a little differently than you might have heard it, so just bear with me. I was born into an era that was filled with rumors that the end of the world could be just around the corner. And that was at the little church I attended, but also in the world around me, even as a small kid. I learned reading and writing and arithmetic in Norfolk, Virginia. It was between my duck and cover drills at school, where the teacher would lead her class single file into the hallway, where we were to stretch out along the wall and lay down with our heads covered, with our hands away from any windows where a nuclear blast would send its scorching heat and glass fragments through our little bodies. We were also taught and practiced how to get under our desks as quickly as possible if we saw a flash of light and we weren't able to get into the hallway in time. Duck and cover under the desk. And whatever you do, don't look at the light, because you could be blinded. I was 10 years old and really more interested in playing with my toys and riding my bike than trying to figure out everything that was going on in the world of adults. I had seen pictures in magazines and also on our black and white TV of a mushroom cloud. And I knew that it was supposed to be a bad thing. I knew that the adults were scared of it. But it really didn't hit home to me until one evening, my parents told my brother and I that they wanted to talk with us. My father worked in communications at Hampton Roads Military Base. It was a time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and my father was so sure, he says something about how close we came. He was so sure that the potential for all-out nuclear war was about to happen, that he was desperate to do anything he could to save his family. So he carefully rehearsed us. He believed he might be one of the first people who would know that a war was about to take place because he worked in communication. We were sworn to secrecy, and under no circumstances were we allowed to tell any of our friends or our teachers what we knew. If we were in school and we heard our names over the loudspeaker, we were to come down to the office, we were to run, not walk, as fast as we possibly could, so that my mother and father would be waiting for us, could throw us into the back of our old Chevy and attempt to drive away from what would surely be ground zero in a nuclear holocaust. So that evening, when they told us about their plans, we watched as our mother feverishly packed cardboard boxes full of canned goods to put in the trunk of the car in order to preserve her family. And my brother and I were both excited and afraid. Excited at the adventure of maybe getting out of school, and afraid knowing we might never be able to return. As far as I understood, I was living in the end times. The apocalypse. Even if I didn't understand what that word meant, it was scary. Eventually, the missile crisis passed. But the crises did not end as I grew older. President Kennedy was shot. Martin Luther King was shot. Robert Kennedy was shot. All over the country, people were demonstrating for civil rights. There were demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. Young men were refusing to be drafted. Demonstrating students were shot on the Kent State campus by the National Guard. It appeared at times that our country and our culture was beginning to unravel. The poetry of this time was often full of anger and darkness. But sometimes it also conveyed glimmers of hope, of what could be. It was as if the world as I knew it was ending. All my life, as I have studied the Bible, the passages that have given me the greatest difficulty to understand and to interpret have been the eschatological, the apocalyptic, or the end times passages. Not only are there are many of these passages, both in the Old and the New Testament, but the symbols and the power of these passages are so dramatic and unearthly that we are often more tempted to flee them or ignore them than to take them seriously. One response to these passages is simply to take them literal. There are preachers who have built entire careers off these passages, using them to predict the future. As a matter of fact, every generation has those who use these passages as a detailed map to predict who the Antichrist is, where the next threat is coming from, who the enemies are. Not only that, they end up predicting the immediate end of the world. And from this we get tragedies like the Davidian compound and the loss of innocent lives. But worse than that, you get a large part of the church that lives as if they are the last generation before what's called the rapture. And they end up not taking responsibility for the future they are leaving to the next generation. Why bother with improving the schools if the coming of the Lord makes that irrelevant? Why bother with a degrading environment if the world is coming to an end in your generation? For those who believe in the imminent return of our Lord, it's almost like they get a pass on any social responsibility for the next generation. They better be absolutely sure that Jesus is coming back immediately, because they are betting the future of their children and their grandchildren on it. Have you ever noticed in some of the passages in the Old Testament, when the prophets warn of the coming of God's judgment upon the people, that they describe the consequences in cosmic and absolute terms? That's how a poet speaks. Now, if a scientist had written it, it would be more cautious, more measured. Well, a certain percentage of your population may be killed or wounded, but not the prophets. With their poetic description, they often speak of all life being destroyed, the very stars and planets being affected by the hand of God's judgment. In terms of scientific description, they leave much to be desired. But in terms of poetic drama that reaches into the very hearts of the hearers and grabs them, the prophet's words cannot be beat. As a matter of fact, the hearers of the prophets did understand that the world was coming to an end. Their world was coming to an end. The luxury they lived in was coming to an end. The ease with which they cheated people in business was coming to an end. The false sense of security that they had created with their temple sacrifices, thinking God would be impressed more by the smoke of their sacrifices than whether or not they treated their neighbor with justice, was all coming to an end. Whether it was being defeated by their enemies or enslaved in a foreign land, their world had come to an end. In the New Testament, when the Romans occupied Judea by force and the Jewish nation was in turmoil with revolutionaries and those bent on keeping the status quo, and in the midst of this you hear the words of the prophet Jesus in Mark 13, who sounds like he is talking about the end of the world. He describes in cosmic terms the coming end, warning his followers to keep awake. The question is Jesus talking about the end of the world as his followers knew it? Or is he standing before crowds of common people and ignorant fishermen and predicting what's going to happen in the year 2023 or 2024 AD or beyond? In 70 AD, or 40 years after Jesus, the world came to an end. Rome crushed Jerusalem, the holy city, the great temple, the one where Jesus predicted that not one stone would be left upon another, and was burned to the ground, and its stones were scattered. The Jewish people were scattered. The followers of Jesus were scattered all over the Mediterranean. The world as they knew it had ended. But just because the world had ended as the followers of Jesus had known it, doesn't mean that God was not still at work. The scattering of the church into the Gentile world became permanent because there really was no longer the traditional center of Judaism to return to. And the church continued to reach out even today to those without Christ. Often, in the words of Jesus or in the book of Revelation, there is a description of a birth process. A new age that God is creating. But to do this, the age we live in gets disrupted. The old order starts to pass away in order for God to create something new. Brothers and sisters, we become anxious because we are so attached to the old order. The age we live in, rather than the new thing that the Almighty is trying to create. For the world as we know it is ending. And sure enough, this process is going to be catastrophic at times, painful, disruptive, and frightening. Already, many who put their trust in the empire's promise of economic security have been shocked by how rapidly their homes have lost value or how quickly their investments have shrunk. And we continue to be stunned at the fact that guerrilla warfare tied down the most powerful, sophisticated army on earth while economically bleeding us to death, not to mention bleeding our soldiers to death. We're shocked at the lack of foundational values of the children we raise, even though they often see modeled in us that spiritual values are secondary to getting ahead. The world as we know it is coming to an end. But the scripture never leaves us without hope, even in the midst of pronouncing judgment. Listen to the prophet Malachi, as he warns of God's judgment and God's hope. See, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all the evildoers will be stubble. And the day that comes shall burn them up, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise with healing in its wings. In the midst of the dying of the old, there will be healing for those who revere and trust in God. And then in the words of Jesus, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21, verses 5 to 19. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down." And they asked the teacher, "When will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I'm he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." And then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But for all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you, and they will hand you over to the synagogue and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your mind not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. Jesus promises his followers that they will be hated because, of course, they are not of the old order, the old world, the old way of thinking, the old way of doing. They will follow the way of Jesus, and because they do, God will watch over them, even in the midst of a world that is coming to an end, because they keep trying to be faithful to their Lord. They will gain their very souls, their very lives. Jesus is inviting us, you and me, and saying, I invite you to join me in being the very presence of the future now. Let me say that again. Jesus is inviting us, you and me, saying, I invite you to join me in being the very presence of the future now. The world, as you and I know it, is going to end, but don't be afraid. The Almighty is creating a new thing. I will be with you. I will meet the needs of those who follow me, says Jesus. Revelation 21, 1 through 4 says, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. The sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples. And God himself will be with them. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. You and I are invited to be a part of God's future now. A people of grace who come to know the grace of God for themselves, and their love, their God's beloved. They're cherished by God. And then when that sinks in enough, they begin to realize, oh my gosh, that means grace is offered for my neighbor too. I must offer them grace and forgiveness too. We become a people of peace, even towards our enemy. For what God is showing us is that they are God's children too. We become a people of simplicity, that our resources might be available to God and unchained from our culture, so that we're set free to let go of them, to serve the work of God in the world. God's future means being a people of community, that we do not have to travel alone and discover that Jesus is in one another, in each other's faces. The faithful one who will be with us. The world is ending. Do not be afraid. Instead, be ready to bear witness to the hope that is in you. Always. Always.